He was subjected to ridicule, humiliation, and physical abuse. However, they were unaware of the identity of the individual with whom they were engaging in a game. The bus journey to Lincoln Heights, Missouri, was lengthy and tranquil. Dorian leaned against the window, observing the transformation of the landscape, from congested streets to suburban neighborhoods in which each house resembled the previous one. Despite the fact that it was not his initial experience as the new child, this transition felt distinct. His uncle had advised him to regard it as a new beginning, as his mother had secured a more lucrative position. However, in a town such as this, fresh beginnings were non-existent when one resembled him. The instant he entered Richmond High's campus, he could feel it, the pause in conversation as he passed, the way some of the students glanced at him, then looked away as if they had not been staring for a long time. The teachers were exceedingly polite, with their smiles appearing slightly too tight and their accents appearing slightly too cautious. Dorian did not respond. He had previously visited this location. The initial few periods were relatively uneventful. He occupied his seat, responded to inquiries, and maintained his concentration on the task at hand. However, the sensation of being observed had become ingrained by lunchtime, resembling an irritation beneath his skin. He searched the cafeteria for a seat while holding his tray. Groups were engaged in discussions that did not involve him, as the majority of tables were already occupied. A small number of pupils whispered while exchanging glances. It was then that he observed an unoccupied seat adjacent to a man who appeared to be preoccupied with scrolling through his phone. Although it was not optimal, it would suffice. Dorian had scarcely placed his tray down when a voice broke through the din. "You lost?" He pivoted. A blond individual with an effortless grin and an excessive amount of self-assurance reclined in his chair, while a few others at his table observed him with amusement. Dorian exhaled slowly. "Didn't know I needed a map." The individual chuckled and shook his head. "I am simply verifying. There are not many new features in this area." The hesitation in his voice, the unspoken component of that sentence, was detected by Dorian. His expression was inscrutable as he met the individual's gaze. "Guess I'm the exception." The smirk broadened, but there was an additional motivation, possibly amusement or curiosity. "Welcome to Ridgemont, man." Dorian did not respond. He merely sat down and retrieved his utensil. The message was unambiguous, this was merely the beginning. However, what had initially begun as a few glances and murmurs was on the brink of becoming significantly more detrimental. Initially, the incidents were minor, a few innocuous remarks in the corridors, whispered loudly enough for him to hear. "Didn't know they let guys like him in here. Wonder how long he'll last." Nothing new had been disclosed to him. Dorian disregarded it. He was not present to amuse their ignorance. However, Bryce was not the sort to overlook matters. Bryce Danner exuded an air of assurance that emanated from his conviction that no one would ever scrutinize him. He was followed by his crew as if he were a form of royalty, as his father owned half of the auto dealerships in town. The golden child of the student body, the quarterback, was the type of individual who could get away with anything. Bryce had determined that Dorian's presence at Ridgemont was an issue for whatever reason. The initial genuine examination occurred at Dorian's compartment. He was in the process of exchanging his books when he was abruptly propelled forward by a sudden bump. The sound reverberated down the hall as his shoulder collided with the metal. Bryce's voice was a feigned innocence as he said, "Oops. Didn't see you there." Dorian did not respond. His movements were slow and controlled as he finished collecting his notebook and closed his locker. They would become disinterested if he did not provide them with anything. Bryce chuckled. "You appear to be quite reserved, don't you? That is quite impressive. Extremely impressive." Dorian turned and gazed at him, his expression betraying neither fear nor anger. "I am merely perusing." Bryce's grin briefly shifted. Then, one of his friends, Nick, or possibly Kyle, muttered something, and Bryce grinned once more. "Catch you later, new guy." Dorian observed them depart. The hallway hubbub resumed. That was the initial instance. The second occasion occurred in the cafeteria. Dorian was on his way to the garbage cans when a foot suddenly emerged. It was not discreet. It was not intended to be. He prevented himself from falling by catching himself as his body lurched forward. Laughter. Bryce raised his hands. "Take it easy, sir. It was a prank." Dorian did not respond. He refrained from gazing at him. He simply stepped over Bryce's foot and continued to proceed. Additional amusement. "Too simple," someone murmured. Dorian tightened his mandible. His uncle's voice reverberated in his mind. "A lion doesn't flinch when the hyenas bark." He inhaled. "Release it." However, this was inadequate for them. Because on the third occasion, Bryce ensured that it was not a prank. And that was the moment when everything began to shift. Dorian had just completed his work in the library after school. The majority of the pupils had already departed. The parking lot was only half full. He was not in a hurry. He did not object to taking his time, as his mother would not be returning from work for several hours. He detected voices that were excessively familiar as he exited the building. "Hey, new guy!" Something struck Dorian's back with force, and he had scarcely had time to react. He stumbled forward, but he managed to steady himself before colliding with the pavement. Laughter. He made a gradual pivot. Nick, Kyle, and a few other individuals, whose names were irrelevant, flanked Bryce. Bryce was still holding his drink cup, and the final few drops were dripping from his fingertips. "Oh, damn," Bryce apologized without even attempting to convey remorse. "Didn't see you there." Dorian cast an inquisitive look downward. His hoodie was splattered with soda, and ice cubes were dispersed at his feet. There was an extended period of silence between them. Other students, who were remaining in the parking lot, had paused to observe. Dorian stabilized himself by inhaling through his nostrils. Bryce's lips curled upward. "Come on, brother. Speak up." Dorian refrained from doing so. He had just begun to walk past him. Bryce shoved him at that moment. It was not amusing. It was not merely a jest. The intention was to provoke, and the language was forceful. Dorian staggered backwards by one step. His respiration was tranquil. His fingertips flexed at his sides. Bryce chuckled. "What? Are you frightened?" Nick advanced with a grimace. "No, sir. He is simply naive." Dorian had been subjected to the phrase "walk away" throughout his entire existence. He could hear his uncle's voice in his mind. "Maintain your hands in your pockets. Do not provide them with the item they desire." However, at this time, Bryce was not seeking an effortless chuckle. It was not a mere game for him. He desired a response. He desired to establish a point. Dorian exhaled deeply for the final time. He then placed his rucksack on the ground. Bryce raised an eyebrow. "What? Do you have anything to say at this time?" Dorian declined to respond. He simply rolled his shoulders back. Bryce laughed. "Man, you..." He did not advance beyond that point. Dorian relocated. A single step, quick and tidy. A feint to the left that was just enough to elicit a response from Bryce. Subsequently, he received a direct right hook to the ribcage. The noise was nauseating. As his body collapsed, Bryce's oxygen was expelled in a choked gasp. However, Dorian was not yet finished. A pivot. An epithet. In perfect condition. Bryce's head abruptly jerked back, and his legs buckled before he could even contemplate remaining upright. He collided with the pavement. Difficult. Silence. Nick and the others gazed at each other, their mouths hanging agape. Dorian took a stride back, adjusting his hoodie and maintaining a steady breath. Managed. Bryce rolled onto his side, grunting. It was ultimately Dorian who spoke. "You done?" Bryce declined to respond. "He has just spewed." Dorian observed the others. "Anyone else?" No one relocated. Dorian lifted his rucksack and slung it over his shoulder. He dispersed without uttering another word. However, the events that transpired in that parking lot were not yet concluded. It was merely the beginning. The entire institution was informed by the following morning. Dorian was not required to consult his phone in order to determine this. The manner in which individuals regarded him was indicative of their opinions. The glances were no longer merely an expression of curiosity. They differed. A few individuals were astonished. A number of individuals were anxious. A few individuals gazed at him as if they were witnessing him for the first time. Bryce was not attending school. He was not taken aback by that aspect. In front of half the parking lot, you were unable to recover from such a blow overnight. Kyle and Nick? They maintained their distance. Dorian entered the classroom without any indication of what had transpired. Seated. He retrieved his notebook. Business as usual. However, this did not imply that individuals were finished conversing. During lunch, he traversed the cafeteria. When he passed away, conversations became more subdued. People murmured. Several individuals nodded in an apparent indication of their newfound regard for him. Some freshman students, who had never even encountered him before, treated him as if he were a legendary figure. Then there were the others. "Damn, I didn't realize the new guy had hands," someone murmured as he passed by. Another voice chimed in. Bryce was due for it. "Heard he's not coming back for a week." Dorian disregarded it. He was not present to serve as a hero. He was not seeking validation. Subsequently, as he seated down, He heard an additional sound. He's just another violent thug. The language was gentle, but it was insufficiently gentle. Dorian's head tilted significantly. A table in close proximity was occupied by a pair of females. One of them, a brunette with expensive-looking jewelry and an expression that suggested she was smelling something unpleasant, looked aside upon realizing that he had hurt her. His intestines contracted. That was the peculiarity of occasions such as these. No matter how justified you were or how correct the situation felt, someone always found a way to twist it. However, he did not harbor any remorse. Bryce had departed in search of an altercation. Dorian simply ensured that he obtain one. Nevertheless, the burden of it all weighed heavily on him. He had dedicated years to his training. Years of self-regulation. Decades ago. That was not a sign of vulnerability. That was fortitude. Therefore, why did it seem as though, regardless of his decision, his identity had already been determined by others? However, Dorian was about to discover that genuine strength was not solely derived from the ability to deliver a punch. It pertained to the subsequent events. The entire institution was informed by the following morning. Dorian was not required to consult his phone in order to determine this. The manner in which individuals regarded him was indicative of their opinions. The glances were no longer merely a source of curiosity, they were distinct. A few individuals were astonished. A number of individuals were anxious. A few individuals gazed at him as if they were witnessing him for the first time. Bryce was not attending school. He was not taken aback by that aspect. In the presence of half the parking lot, you were unable to recover from such a blow overnight. Kyle and Nick? They maintained their distance. Dorian entered the classroom without any indication of what had transpired. Seated. He retrieved his notebook. Business as usual. However, this did not imply that individuals were finished conversing. As he traversed the cafeteria during lunch, conversation ceased as he passed. People murmured. Several individuals nodded in an apparent indication of their newfound regard for him. Some freshman students, who had never even encountered him before, behaved as though he were a legendary figure. Then there were the others. "Damn, I didn't realize the new guy had hands," someone murmured as he passed by. Another voice chimed in, "Bryce was due for it. Heard he's not coming back for a week." Dorian disregarded it. He was not present to serve as a hero. He was not seeking validation. Subsequently, as he seated down, he heard an additional sound. He's just another violent thug. The language was gentle, but it was insufficiently gentle. Dorian's head tilted significantly. A table in close proximity was occupied by a pair of females. One of them, a brunette with expensive-looking jewelry and an expression that suggested she was smelling something unpleasant, looked aside upon realizing that he had hurt her. His intestines contracted. That was the peculiarity of occasions such as these. No matter how justified you were or how correct the situation felt, someone always found a way to twist it. However, he did not harbor any remorse. Bryce had departed in search of an altercation. Dorian simply ensured that he obtain one. Nevertheless, the burden of it all weighed heavily on him. He had dedicated years to his training. Years of self-regulation. Decades ago. That was not a sign of vulnerability. That was fortitude. Therefore, why did it seem as though, regardless of his decision, his identity had already been determined by others? However, Dorian was about to discover that genuine strength was not solely derived from the ability to deliver a punch. It pertained to the subsequent events. The remainder of the week transpired in a blur. Bryce had yet to arrive. Dorian was no longer bothered by his companions. The glances gradually diminished. The murmurs diminished in volume. However, there was still an unresolved issue. The sensation was palpable to Dorian. Coach Harrison summoned him one afternoon as he exited the gym. "Got a minute?" Dorian hesitated. He was not in the mood for a lecture. However, the coach's tone caused him to pause. They exited the building and positioned themselves in close proximity to the track, where the football team was concluding its practice. "I was informed of the events," Coach stated. "Figured you had your reasons." Dorian responded with a gesture. He was not inclined to offer an apology. The coach conducted an examination of him. "You a fighter?" Dorian shook his head. "Been boxing since I was a kid." The coach issued a subdued whistle. That much was evident. "You are doing well, however, may I inquire as to whether or not that alteration was significant?" Dorian gazed at him, uncertain about the direction of the conversation. The coach crossed his arms. "Do you believe that Bryce has acquired any new knowledge? Do you believe the remaining individuals did the same?" Dorian exhaled and ran his hand over his cranium. He was aware of the solution. Bryce was not inclined to contemplate. And as for the others, some regard him with respect at present, others harbor apprehensions towards him, and some will always perceive him in their preferred manner, regardless of his actions. Coach nodded, as if he could perceive the thoughts that were circulating in Dorian's mind. The issue is, individuals such as Bryce do not truly lose, at least not in a lasting sense. He will return. He will continue to speak, and the cycle will commence once more. However, you are distinct. You are in charge. Dorian expressed dissatisfaction. What are you saying? Coach's head was inclined towards the field. I have been requesting that the boxing coach send me a few children for wrestling. Have you ever considered utilizing all of that talent more effectively? Dorian blanks. Wrestling? The coach smiled. Look, I am confident that you are capable of managing your own affairs. It is evident that this is the case. However, there is a distinction between securing a victory and acquiring the ability to assert one's authority. I have observed an inordinate number of children, such as yourself, being confined to a reputation they never desired. Demonstrate that you are capable of more than that. Dorian did not respond immediately. For an extended period, combat had been a matter of survival, about maintaining one's position. However, the manner in which Coach addressed him and the manner in which he looked at him did not indicate that he was attempting to prove a point. It was about becoming more. Dorian gazed at his uncle's antiquated boxing gloves from his bed that evening. He reflected on the numerous occasions on which he had refrained from speaking up, of which he had walked away, and of the one occasion on which he had not. The coach was correct. Bryce would not alter. Individuals would contemplate their desires. However, Dorian continued to possess an alternative. And perhaps, just maybe, this time he would create a unique one. Because genuine fortitude was not solely determined by the ability to discern when to engage in combat. It was a matter of determining the cause for which struggle. If this narrative resonated with you, please click the subscribe icon. Life is replete with options, and occasionally the most challenging one is determining one's identity. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to stand your ground? Let's discuss it in the comments. What was your approach to the situation? We should continue the dialogue.